Hello and welcome back to Suchitra's Biology. Hope you all are doing good. So today we are going to discuss about the human heart. So let's start. I have already drawn the diagram of the heart, although it's not that good, but I will try to explain. Okay. So this is the human heart. It has four chambers. It has four chambers. That is right auricle, right ventricle, left auricle and left ventricle. Okay, right auricle, right ventricle, left auricle and left ventricle. Two atria and two ventricles. Now, the body cells produce CO2, right? The body cells produce CO2. This CO2 or the deoxygenated blood goes into the right atrium. Okay, the deoxygenated blood goes from the body cells to the right auricle. This is the inferior vena cava. Inferior vena cava. This is the superior vena cava. Superior vena cava. What is superior and inferior vena cava? Let me explain. Inferior vena cava is the pathway that brings the deoxygenated blood from the lower body, while superior vena cava brings deoxygenated blood from the upper body parts. Okay, these two will bring the deoxygenated blood into the right auricle. So deoxygenated blood is brought into the right auricle. Now the deoxygenated blood goes into the it's not visible, into the right ventricle. Okay, now between right auricle and right ventricle there is a valve known as tricuspid valve. Tricuspid valve. Okay, it is a interauricular and ventricular valve between the atria and ventricles. Atrioventricular valve. It is atrioventricular valve between right auricle and right ventricle. Okay, so when the valve is closed, the blood cannot flow into the right ventricle. When the valve opens, the blood flows into the right ventricle. Okay, now this blood from the right ventricle goes to the lungs. Okay, for oxygenation. What lungs does? It helps in the oxygenation of the blood, right? So this is known as the pathway or this tube like structure that opens from right ventricle and goes to the lungs is called pulmonary artery. It is known as pulmonary artery. It is the only artery that carries deoxygenated blood. All other arteries in the body carry oxygenated blood only. Okay, so this is the exception. So it is very important to remember this. Pulmonary artery is the only artery in the body that carries deoxygenated blood to the lungs, right? Now, one more important thing, the deoxygenated blood was brought by the inferior vena cava from the lower body part and superior vena cava from the upper body part, right? Another thing that brings deoxygenated blood is coronary sinus. Coronary sinus brings deoxygenated blood from the heart itself. Okay, the heart tissues also produce CO2 while working, so the coronary sinus will bring the deoxygenated blood into the right auricle. So superior vena cava, inferior vena cava and coronary sinus bring deoxygenated blood into the right auricle. Now the deoxygenated blood goes into right auricle, then right ventricle. Now this goes into the lungs by pulmonary artery. Now in the lungs the blood gets oxygenated, right? Now the blood has become oxygenated. It reaches into the left atrium. This is pulmonary vein. Now this is also the only vein in the body that brings oxygenated blood. All other veins in the body bring deoxygenated blood. Like, okay. So this was the only artery that brings deoxygenated blood, and this is the only vein that brings oxygenated blood. So these two are very important. Now the oxygenated blood has reached over here. Now there is a valve between left atrium and left ventricle. That is known as, this is bicuspid or mitral valve. Okay, mitral valve. Since it is present between the atrium and ventricle, it is also a atrioventricular valve like tricuspid valve. Okay, this is present between left atrium and left ventricle. Okay, now the oxygenated blood from the left ventricle will leave the ventricle and will reach to the cells. As cells need oxygen, so the oxygenated blood from the left ventricle will reach the body parts. This is known as aorta. Okay, aorta brings the oxygenated blood from the left ventricle to the body parts. So this is the complete double circulation. It is known as double circulation because the blood flows into the heart twice. Okay, so it is known as double circulation. Okay, this inferior vena cava has a inferior vena cava, and between the inferior vena cava and the right atrium there is a valve known as Eustacious Wall. Okay, known as Eustachian Wall. Between the inferior vena cava and right atrium. As blood goes into the right atrium, this Eustachian wall prevents the backflow of the blood into the inferior vena cava, right? Superior vena cava does not have any wall, because if blood flows from the upper body parts into the right atrium, there is no chance of the backflow, na? But if the blood is flowing through the inferior vena cava, and if the valve is open, it can come back. So there is a valve called Eustachian valve. Superior vena cava does not have any valve. Now there are valves between the right ventricle and the lungs, and the left ventricle and the aorta. Okay, these are known as semilunar valves. Semilunar valves. Okay, semilunar valves are present between the right ventricle and the lungs, and left ventricle and the aorta. Okay, the deoxygenated blood comes from the body parts through inferior vena cava from the lower body, superior vena cava from the upper body, and coronary sinus that brings the deoxygenated blood from the heart itself. All the deoxygenated blood of the body comes into the right atrium. Then there is a valve between right atrium and right ventricle, that is known as tricuspid valve. Okay, when the tricuspid valve opens, the blood from the right atrium flows into the right ventricle. Now there is a valve between the right ventricle and the pulmonary artery. Okay, that is known as semilunar valve. It prevents the backflow of blood through the pulmonary artery. This blood goes to the lungs. So there is a valve. It will prevent the backflow of the blood right? That is known as semilunar valve. Now in lungs, the oxygenation of the blood occurs and the oxygenated blood goes to the left atrium. Now between the left atrium and the left ventricle there is a valve called the bicuspid or the mitral valve. When the mitral or the bicuspid valve opens, the blood from the left atrium comes into the left ventricle. Okay. Now the left ventricle, now the blood from the left ventricle goes to the other body parts, right? There is also a semilunar valve present between the left ventricle and the aorta. One semilunar valve was present between the right ventricle and the pulmonary artery, this one. And one semilunar valve is present between the left ventricle and the aorta. Okay. This is the atrioventricular septum. Tricuspid and bicuspid valves are atrioventricular valves, sorry. Okay. This is the septum, interventricular septum. The septum between the two ventricles is called interventricular septum. The septum between the two auricles is known as interatrial septum, and the septum between the atria and ventricle is called atrioventricular septum. Okay, so this was all about the heart. Okay, human heart. If you like the video, do like, share and subscribe my channel. Thank you.